For my part, I continued doing patrols in the Jackson, and as I said before, a couple of times we were lucky to be given a mid-patrol break and allowed to go to Hawaii for a few days. But that was only a couple of times, if I remember right, in the 4 years I was on the Jackson. In those 2 instances, the guys went out and enjoyed themselves, but not me. I stayed on the boat, for I did not want to tempt fate. Many of the men, including some of the married ones, had a saying, "What happens out to sea stays out to sea," and would go out to the bars, etc. I didn't want to get caught in that, so I would stay on the boat. At the end of the pier in Hawaii we used to be moored in, there was a payphone, from which I would call my wife, and at first we would talk for hours, running a big phone bill back home, for I was calling collect. I missed her and didn't want to cheat on her, so instead of going out with the guys, getting drunk, and having something happen that I would regret later, I chose to stay on the boat. For the first port calls, she also sounded like she missed me, for we were on that 2-year or so infatuation stage in the relationship, where you were so into each other. But as the patrols began to add up, my marriage began to crumble. The constant separation was a big part of it, but also, as I said before, the differences in our values and expectations of what our marriage should be like were just too different. In some ways, I was a little more mature than she was, and once in a marriage I was expecting the dedication I had seen in my parents, the sacrifice of one for the other, the holding back by one, while the other one was restricted in his freedom like my father and I were, for that matter. I also expected the curtailing of at-risk behaviors, as I was doing. If I didn't have her around, I was not going to go into bars or dancing and put myself in a position where I'd be tempted to cheat on her. I expected her to do likewise, but to her, that was out of the question. Her phrase would be, "You're trying to control me," every time the subject came up for her to please stay away from the bar scene while I was gone. Now, by that point in time, I had already been around the block, in Brockport, California, and Daytona, and I'd seen what a couple of drinks could do to your inhibitions and your common sense. I knew that, given the right conditions, anyone can make a mistake. So I chose not to put myself in that kind of situation, to be tempted to do what is wrong when you are sober. But as the drinks keep coming and coming, look less and less bad, I also knew that a single wrong action could destroy a marriage, especially one as fragile as mine was. I pleaded with her to try to prevent something from happening that we couldn't take back once it did, but to her this was a non-starter. Therefore, given the more and more independent behaviors I was seeing from her, I began to worry and fear that my marriage was not going to last. The immaturity I was seeing also didn't make me want to have a child with her yet, especially while I was going out to sea. For if you're having problems in a marriage, a child is not the answer to fix them, and in many cases just makes things worse. My hope was that if we could survive my sea duty, going out to sea, then when I came to shore duty, working at the base and going home at night, we could perhaps reunite our souls once more, and to be as close as we had been at the beginning of our relationship. But that was not to be. The nail in the coffin in our marriage was when she decided she wanted to be a bartender in a local low-life watering hole in Bremerton and quit her waitress job. My idea was for her to go back to school instead and get an education. Yes, it would require for us to tighten our belts, but at least she could get out of the low-wage job she was in. But she would have none of it. She wanted to be a bartender. In addition to being a crappy place, on the weekends the bar had local live music and a dance floor, becoming the magnet for every guy looking to get lucky in the area. Now, she'd never been a bartender in her life, nor did she know anything about it, except knowing what a few drinks were from her waitress job. But she looked good and had a great figure, and when she went to apply for the job, that was enough, and she got hired on the spot. Our marriage was doomed. She began working in the bar toward the last year and a half of our marriage, when I had about 3 submarine patrols left, if I remember right. By this time, she and I were almost strangers, cohabiting in the same apartment, and my heart was breaking. After I came back from the third-to-last patrol, I think she had cheated on me already, for someone busted the windows on our little Daihatsu for no reason, and her reaction to this left me wondering. What I think happened in retrospect was that she probably had an affair and had broken it off just before I got home from my submarine patrol. The guy pissed off at her, busted our car's windows in retaliation, the car she was driving to and from the bar she worked in. At the time I thought it was vandalism, but later I found out the area we lived in was very quiet and not a lot of crime. Plus, the damage was done only to our car and not anyone else's. Shortly after, we traded in the Daihatsu for a red 1992 Toyota MR2 sports car for her. She wanted a cute sports car, and so I got her one. It was under my name, for the credit line was mine. 3 months later, after I returned from my last patrol, she left me for someone she had met at the bar. I was devastated. I had put all my eggs in one basket and lost. A couple of years before, she and I had flown from Bremerton to visit my parents in West New York, who wanted to meet her. Well, things didn't go well. First, my parents' little apartment was problematic for a guest to stay over. Then the cultural differences emerged. A couple of arguments occurred, and I tried to be the go-between, but ultimately sided with my wife. Needless to say, the trip had been a disaster, and had strained my relationship with my parents. But I had sided with her and assumed, here we go, that she understood what a big deal that was, and what it meant in terms of my devotion towards her. Clearly, she didn't. And so, although I had made her my life, that was not good enough for her. And so she found herself a new boy toy. This was the lowest point in my life. I'd never felt this awful before or since. And this would change me forever. Although I had gained knowledge about people, in many ways I was still very naive. Before this heartbreak, my assumption was that as long as people loved each other, betrayals like this would be a non-issue. As Disney said, love conquers all, right? Well, here was a wake-up, a realization that the world was a lot different than what I thought it was. I realized that, depending on the person, loving them was not enough on some occasions, and that, for some people, their love of self was more important than the love they received from others. What a way to find out. For a few days there, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and was a bit suicidal. I called my parents and told them what was happening, even breaking down in the middle of the conversations. But they could do little from West New York. Also, a flight over to me was out of the question, for they were still very poor. Therefore, I was alone. A few of the guys on the boat tried to help, but most of the help was actually from the Navy itself, who pulled me out of submarine duty temporarily and gave me counseling sessions. On my initial evaluation session, my heartbreak and sadness must have been so great that at the end of the session, 2 of the doctors who were interviewing me were also in tears. It felt like life was over, and that there was no reason to go on living. I also briefly dove into a bottle, and had a couple of days where strong alcohol was my close friend. Then I started to go to counseling for months, and was assigned temporary shore duty over at the base. But then I asked myself, what am I doing? She was going on with her life, while I was sinking deeper and deeper into a hole from which I might never come out. Are you stupid? I asked myself. For the next few months, slowly, and with the help of the Navy counseling sessions, I began to stabilize myself. Stabilized, I say, for I was not even close to recovery yet. Then I got good enough to be reinstated to submarine duty by the Navy, and it was time to get permanent shore duty orders. Wanting to leave the area and leave my pain behind, I begged the Navy for orders to the other side of the country at the submarine base in Groton, Connecticut, and I got them. And so I packed all my belongings, most of which would be moved by the Navy, and a few things which I would take with me in the MR2, and got ready to drive across the country. I had kept the MR2, for on top of the car being in my name, she didn't make enough to take over the car payments and take care of herself at the same time. Never mind the guy she had left me for was a mama's boy and was still living with his mother. Nice going. I drove from Washington State to Groton, Connecticut, resting in hotels at night along the way, ending with a stopover at my parents' place in West New York. I left Bremerton on a Monday morning, crossed the mountains from western to eastern Washington via I-90, and headed for Twin Falls, Idaho, to say goodbye to her parents, for they'd been very nice to me over the few years I had known them. The meeting with her parents was a quick goodbye, and after leaving a few tears, I continued south in order to reach I-80, then drove straight east. The trip took me a little over 3 days, in which I managed to clear my mind some. As I drove cross-country, I thought about my life and what I wanted to do, but the pain was still there. More time would need to pass before the wound would start to heal. I reached my parents' place on Thursday and stayed with them for a few days until Sunday, for I had asked for a week-long leave. Sunday afternoon I resumed my trip to Groton, arriving there Sunday night. A new chapter in my life was now about to begin.